"You're not welcome here," Daniel Whitmore said without even standing up from the leather chair by the fireplace, as if he had been waiting for her to walk through the door and claim what was already hers. Margaret Whitmore stopped just inside the entryway of the lake house, her hand still resting on the brass doorknob, the cool October air slipping in behind her. She had driven nearly 4 hours from Minneapolis, the highway stretching in long gray ribbons under a pale sky, expecting nothing more dramatic than the quiet ritual of closing up the house for the winter. The gravel in the driveway had crunched under her tires the same way it always had, the tall pines along Lake Harmon swaying gently, the water beyond them flat and silver like brushed steel. But the porch light had been on when she arrived, and thin smoke had curled from the chimney, a domestic detail that did not belong to an empty house. She had told herself it was a faulty timer or a neighbor checking in. She had unlocked the door with her own key, the same key she had carried on her ring for 23 years, only to find the scent of unfamiliar cologne mingling with the faint trace of cedar and old books. Daniel sat there in her late husband's chair, one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, a half-empty mug on the side table, as though he had always had the right to place it there. At 72, he still carried himself with the casual entitlement of an older brother who believed the world owed him something for simply being first. Margaret did not gasp or raise her voice. She closed the door gently behind her and set her overnight bag down on the braided rug she and Thomas had bought during their first summer at the lake. "That's interesting," she said evenly, her tone neither warm nor cold, just precise. The living room looked subtly rearranged. A plaid blanket she did not recognize was draped over the sofa, and a pair of men's boots sat near the hearth. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, and the faint lapping of water against the dock carried through the glass. Daniel's eyes traveled over her as if assessing a trespasser. "You should have called before coming up," he added. Margaret took a slow breath. She was 68 years old, a retired property attorney who had spent 4 decades reviewing deeds, drafting trusts, and correcting other people's careless assumptions about ownership. She had not come to argue. She had come to inspect the furnace, drain the pipes, and spend one quiet night remembering the sound of Thomas laughing on the dock at sunrise. Instead, she found her brother-in-law occupying the space like a man staking a claim. "This house belongs to the Whitmore family," Daniel continued, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "It's time we talked about that." Margaret glanced at the framed photograph above the mantel, Thomas smiling with a fishing rod in hand, sunlight catching the side of his face. For a moment, the room felt suspended between past and present. She walked further inside, her heels making soft, deliberate taps against the hardwood floor. "We are talking," she replied. There was no tremor in her voice. No visible anger. Only calculation. Daniel shifted slightly, perhaps expecting resistance, perhaps hoping for it. He did not receive it. Margaret removed her gloves, placing them carefully on the console table near the entry, and took in every detail: the shifted lamp, the stack of mail that had been opened, the faint scrape marks near the back door where something heavy had been dragged. She had learned long ago that silence unsettled people more than outrage. "You've made yourself comfortable," she observed. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're alone now, Margaret," he said. "It doesn't make sense for you to keep a place like this." She met his gaze without flinching. The lake outside darkened as a cloud passed overhead, and the room dimmed just slightly. "Comfort," she said softly, "has never been the same thing as ownership." And for the first time since she stepped inside, Daniel's confidence flickered, just enough for her to see it. Daniel stood slowly this time, as if deciding that remaining seated might weaken whatever claim he believed he was making, and he brushed an invisible speck of dust from his sweater before speaking again. He told her that he had been coming up to the lake for weeks, that he had every right to make use of what he called family property, that Thomas would have wanted the house to stay within the bloodline. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, her eyes moving from Daniel to the bookshelf along the far wall where several volumes had been shifted out of order. She walked toward the kitchen, noting that the overhead light had been replaced with a brighter bulb and that the refrigerator hummed with the weight of fresh groceries. A carton of eggs, A gallon of milk, a package of deli turkey, all recent purchases, all suggesting permanence rather than a casual visit. Daniel followed her, his footsteps heavier now, filling the quiet space that had once held the gentle rhythm of her husband's morning routines. He said that the taxes were too high for a single widow to manage, that heating costs alone during a Minnesota winter could run into thousands of dollars, that it made practical sense for him to step in. Margaret opened the cabinet above the sink and found her porcelain coffee cups pushed to the back, replaced at the front by thick ceramic mugs she did not recognize. She closed the cabinet carefully. "You stepped in without asking," she said, her voice steady, almost conversational. Daniel responded that he had assumed she would understand, that family did not need formal permission. The word assumed lingered between them. Margaret had built an entire career on correcting assumptions, on reminding clients that ownership was not implied by sentiment or proximity, but by documentation and intent. She moved back into the living room and noticed a stack of mail on the console table near the window. Several envelopes had been opened, including the latest property tax statement addressed directly to her. She lifted it gently, smoothing the crease where it had been torn. "Did you read this as well?" she asked. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before saying that he was only trying to help. Outside, the wind picked up, sending a ripple across the surface of the lake that caught the last of the afternoon light. Margaret thought of the first summer she and Thomas had spent here, measuring the dock with a tape measure, debating whether to extend it by 2 feet so that their small fishing boat would sit more securely. They had made every decision together, down to the shade of paint on the shutters. Daniel had visited twice in 20 years. Now he spoke as though history could be rewritten by occupancy. "You are not being realistic," he said, his tone sharpening. "You cannot manage this place on your own." Margaret folded the tax statement and placed it back on the table exactly where she had found it. "I have managed more complex matters than a furnace and a dock," she replied quietly. Daniel shifted again, glancing toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. He mentioned that he had already moved some of his belongings into the guest room, that he had spoken to a contractor about reinforcing the deck before winter, that improvements were necessary. The word improvement sounded less like maintenance and more like possession. Margaret felt no surge of anger, only a tightening of resolve. She walked to the fireplace and ran her fingers lightly along the mantel, tracing the carved initials that Thomas had etched there during their 10th anniversary trip. The wood felt smooth and familiar under her touch. "You changed the locks," she said without looking at him. Daniel admitted that he had done so for security reasons, adding that the area had seen more traffic in recent years. Margaret turned slowly to face him. "Security," she repeated, as if tasting the word. For the first time, there was a faint steel beneath her calm. "That is an interesting choice of protection, considering whose name is on the deed." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no immediate answer came. The house grew quiet again, except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock near the staircase, counting seconds that suddenly felt far more significant than either of them had anticipated. Daniel recovered quickly, drawing himself up as though posture alone could restore authority, and he said that paperwork could be interpreted in many ways, that Thomas had spoken often about keeping things fair between brothers, that intentions mattered more than technicalities. Margaret regarded him with the same measured expression she had used in conference rooms for decades when a client tried to bend language into something it was not. She walked toward the narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms, her steps unhurried, and paused at the doorway of the guest room. A navy suitcase sat open on the quilt she had stitched by hand 15 years earlier. Several shirts were already hanging in the closet, besides spare blankets and winter coats that still smelled faintly of cedar. On the dresser, Daniel had placed a framed photograph of himself and Thomas from their youth, arms slung around each other, smiling at some long-forgotten barbecue. Margaret studied the image without touching it. Memory, she knew, was often used as leverage by those who lacked legal footing. Daniel spoke from behind her, saying that he had felt pushed aside after Thomas passed away, that decisions about the estate had moved too quickly, that he had not been properly consulted. The accusation was delivered softly, almost plaintively, as though the situation were a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate act. Margaret turned back into the hallway, her gaze steady. She remembered the week after the funeral, when Daniel had stood in her living room in Minneapolis and suggested that a lake house was too much responsibility for a grieving widow. She had declined his advice then with polite firmness. She remembered the certified letter he had sent 3 months later, inquiring about shared family interests. She had responded through her attorney, though she herself had drafted the reply. Nothing had been left ambiguous. "You never intended to share this place," Daniel said now, his voice tightening. "You locked it away from the rest of us." Margaret walked back into the living room and picked up her leather briefcase from the floor beside her overnight bag. She had brought it out of habit, not expectation, but habit had served her well throughout her career. She set it on the dining table and clicked open the brass latches. The sound was small, but decisive in the quiet room. Daniel watched, his expression shifting from irritation to something closer to concern. Margaret did not rush. She removed a neatly organized folder, its edges crisp, the tabs labeled in careful handwriting. She had learned long ago that clarity unsettled people who relied on emotion. "Thomas established a revocable living trust 5 years before he passed," she said evenly. "The lake house was transferred into that trust at the same time." Daniel attempted to interrupt, but she raised a hand slightly, not in aggression, but in quiet request for patience. "Upon his death, the trust became irrevocable. I am the sole trustee and beneficiary for the duration of my lifetime." The words were not dramatic. They were factual. Daniel stared at the folder as if it contained something heavier than paper. "That is just your interpretation," he said finally. Margaret slid a copy of the recorded deed across the table toward him. The county seal was visible in the corner, embossed and unmistakable. "It was filed with the county recorder's office," she replied. "Interpretation does not alter recording." Outside, the sky had deepened into early evening blue, and the lake reflected the fading light like glass. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. He said that family disputes should not involve legal threats, that neighbors would talk if authorities became involved, that dignity required discretion. Margaret closed the folder carefully and met his gaze. "Dignity," she said softly, "begins with respect for boundaries." She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of trespassing. She simply let the implication settle between them, as quiet and unavoidable as the dark gathering beyond the windows. Daniel did not touch the deed at first. He stood there with his hands braced against the edge of the dining table, looking down at the county seal as though it might dissolve if he stared at it long enough. The room felt smaller now, not because the walls had shifted, but because certainty had. Margaret closed her briefcase with deliberate care and slid it back to the center of the table, not as a shield, but as a quiet reminder that preparation had not been accidental. She moved toward the window overlooking the lake, folding her arms loosely, her posture composed. The last light of day stretched across the water in long, fading bands of gray and blue. "You always did enjoy turning everything into a courtroom," Daniel said finally, the edge in his voice softened by something closer to frustration than anger. Margaret did not look at him immediately. She watched a pair of ducks skim low over the surface of the lake before settling near the reeds by the dock Thomas had extended by exactly 2 feet one summer afternoon. "This is not a courtroom," she replied. "It is my home." The word home carried weight, but she did not emphasize it. She did not need to. Daniel paced once across the living room, stopping near the fireplace where Thomas's carved initials rested in the wood. He ran his fingers along the mantel as though invoking shared history might rewrite present reality. "You know what this place meant to him," he said. He talked about family gatherings, about keeping it open. Margaret turned slowly. "He kept it open," she answered. "To those who respected it." Silence settled again, punctuated only by the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the steady ticking of the wall clock. Daniel shifted tactics. He spoke about maintenance costs, about how difficult winters had become, about snow accumulation that could reach over 2 feet in a single storm, and the risk of pipes freezing if someone was not present. He framed his occupation as stewardship, as though proximity equaled protection. Margaret listened without interrupting. She had heard variations of this reasoning throughout her career, arguments dressed in practicality to conceal self-interest. She stepped toward the hallway and opened the small utility closet near the stairs. The furnace inspection tag hung neatly from the unit, dated just 3 weeks earlier. She had scheduled the service in advance. The dock had been sealed in late August. The roof had been inspected in early September. Each measure had been taken quietly, without announcement, because ownership did not require performance. She returned to the living room. "The house has been maintained," she said calmly. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You cannot expect me to walk out in the middle of the night," he said. "Where am I supposed to go?" The question hung there, heavy with implication. Margaret studied him for a long moment. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel resentment. She felt clarity. "You have your home in St. Paul," she replied. "It is 180 miles from here." Daniel exhaled sharply, glancing toward the front door as though distance itself were unreasonable. "You would call the authorities over this," he said, disbelief flickering in his tone. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I would protect what is legally mine," she answered. There was no threat in her voice, only resolve. The lake outside had darkened fully now, the sky reflecting a deep navy across the water. Inside, the house held its quiet dignity. Daniel looked older in the lamplight, the confidence that had carried him through the afternoon now visibly strained. Margaret walked to the entryway and picked up her gloves once more, smoothing them over her hands. "You have until morning," she said evenly. "That is more consideration than the law requires." She did not raise her voice. She did not argue further. She simply stood there, composed and immovable, as the clock continued its patient counting, marking the difference between assumption and reality with every measured second. Margaret did not sleep much. That night, though she did not appear restless, she lay on the far side of the bed in the master bedroom, fully dressed except for her shoes, listening to the subtle sounds of the house settling into cooler air, the faint creak of wood beams, the distant rustle of wind along the shoreline, and beneath it all the quiet awareness that the man down the hall believed morning might still bend in his favor. Daniel remained in the guest room, his movements audible but restrained, a drawer closing, the soft thud of a suitcase being shifted, the kind of small domestic noises that carried an undercurrent of reluctance. Margaret stared at the ceiling for a long time, tracing the familiar lines where Thomas had once pointed out a hairline crack and promised to repair it himself. She remembered the afternoon he had signed the trust documents at their dining table in Minneapolis, the way he had insisted on reviewing every clause twice even though she had drafted it with meticulous care. He had not wanted ambiguity. He had wanted protection. Not from strangers, but from misinterpretation by those who believed family ties entitled them to unspoken claims. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, pale and cool against the wooden floor, Margaret rose without hesitation. She moved quietly through the hallway and into the kitchen, placing a kettle on the stove and watching the thin ribbon of steam rise as the water heated. The lake outside appeared calm again, its surface smooth as glass under a soft gray sky. She poured herself a cup of tea and carried it to the dining table, sitting upright, composed, waiting not as someone anxious, but as someone certain of the next step. Daniel emerged shortly after 7 o'clock, dressed in yesterday's clothes, his expression tight with a mixture of fatigue and calculation. He paused when he saw her already seated, as though surprised that she had not wavered overnight. "We can talk about this reasonably," he began, his voice lower now, stripped of some of its earlier confidence. Margaret did not interrupt. She took a measured sip of tea and set the cup down carefully on its saucer. "We have talked," she replied. The clock on the wall marked each second distinctly. Daniel stepped closer to the table, glancing at the briefcase still resting near her overnight bag. He said that leaving immediately would be inconvenient, that he had already arranged for a delivery of firewood later that afternoon, that it would look strange if neighbors saw him packing in haste. Margaret regarded him with steady eyes. "Inconvenience does not alter ownership," she said. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly. He looked toward the window, toward the dock where morning light was beginning to reflect in thin bands across the water. For a moment he seemed less like an adversary and more like an aging man confronting the limits of assumption. "You would really force me out," he said quietly. Margaret did not raise her voice. "I am not forcing you," she answered. "I am enforcing what already exists." The distinction settled between them. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a single sheet of paper, placing it gently on the table. It was a formal notice prepared the previous evening after she had stepped outside to make a brief phone call to her attorney in Minneapolis, a colleague she trusted, someone who understood both procedure and discretion. The document was precise, outlining that continued occupancy without permission would constitute trespassing under Minnesota law. She had not needed to dramatize it. The language was clear enough on its own. Daniel read the first lines, his jaw tightening once more, but this time there was no argument ready to follow. Outside, a small motorboat passed at a distance, its low hum fading quickly across the water. The world beyond the lake house moved forward without concern for their dispute. Margaret folded her hands calmly in front of her. "You have until 9 o'clock, she said. "After that, I will proceed." There was no anger in her tone, only finality. Daniel looked around the room slowly, taking in the fireplace, the photographs, the worn but polished floorboards that had held decades of summers and quiet winters. He seemed to understand at last that presence did not equal possession, and that sentiment could not overwrite documentation. Margaret remained seated, steady and composed, as the morning light strengthened and the clock continued its measured count toward 9. At 8:45, the house felt suspended in a quiet that was no longer uncertain but deliberate, as though even the walls understood that decisions had already been made and were simply waiting for the clock to confirm them. Daniel moved through the guest room with slower motions now, the earlier edge in his posture replaced by a visible strain. Margaret remained seated at the dining table, her briefcase closed, her hands folded calmly over it, listening to the muted sounds of drawers sliding shut and hangers being lifted from the closet rod. She did not rush him, nor did she offer reassurance. Outside, the lake reflected a thin band of morning sunlight, pale and restrained, and a light breeze stirred the tops of the pine trees along the shoreline. At 8:55, Daniel stepped into the hallway with his navy suitcase upright beside him. He paused near the living room, glancing once more at the fireplace, at the carved initials in the mantel, at the framed photographs that had not shifted despite his presence. "You did not have to turn this into a legal matter," he said, though his voice lacked its former conviction. Margaret lifted her eyes to meet his. "It was a legal matter the moment you changed the locks," she replied evenly. Daniel hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small ring of keys. He placed them on the console table near the door with a soft metallic clink that sounded louder than it was. "The contractor was coming at noon," he added quietly, "to reinforce the back deck." Margaret stood and walked toward the back window, looking out at the dock and the narrow strip of wooden deck that had weathered many winters without reinforcement beyond routine care. "There will be no contractor today," she said. "I have already contacted the company and canceled any pending work under your name." Daniel turned toward her, surprise flickering briefly across his face. "You called them," he said. It was not a question. Margaret nodded once. She had stepped outside the previous evening while Daniel remained in the guest room, her phone call measured and concise, confirming that no authorization had been granted for structural changes. She had also notified the local sheriff's office that a family member was vacating the property voluntarily that morning and that no further intervention would be necessary unless requested. Preparation was not hostility. It was clarity. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 9. Daniel gripped the handle of his suitcase and looked around the room as though memorizing it. "Thomas would not have wanted this," he said, softer now, almost reflective. Margaret regarded him without visible emotion. "Thomas wanted peace," she answered. "Peace requires boundaries." The statement lingered between them. At exactly 9 o'clock, the minute hand aligned with its mark, and the sound of the clock's faint mechanical click seemed almost ceremonial. Daniel exhaled, then lifted his suitcase and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, glancing back one final time. There was no dramatic farewell, no raised voices, only the quiet recognition that assumption had reached its limit. Margaret stepped aside to give him space, not in surrender but in resolution. The door opened, letting in a rush of crisp lake air, cool and clean. Gravel shifted under Daniel's shoes as he crossed the driveway toward his car. Margaret stood in the doorway until she heard the engine start and the tires roll slowly away, the sound diminishing along the narrow road that curved back toward the highway. When the vehicle disappeared from view, she closed the door gently and turned the lock with her own key, feeling the familiar resistance of metal meeting metal. She walked through the house once more, room by room, restoring small details that had been displaced, returning her porcelain cups to the front of the cabinet, straightening the quilt in the guest room, adjusting the framed photograph on the mantel so that it sat precisely centered. The house did not feel triumphant. It felt steady. Margaret stepped onto the back deck and looked out over the lake, the water calm beneath the strengthening morning light. Ownership, she knew, was not about control over another person. It was about stewardship of what had been entrusted to her. And in the quiet that followed Daniel's departure, the lake house seemed to settle back into itself, as if acknowledging that clarity had finally returned. The silence that followed Daniel's departure did not feel empty, it felt reclaimed, as though the house had exhaled after holding its breath for weeks. Margaret stood alone in the living room for a long moment, listening to the absence of unfamiliar footsteps, to the steady rhythm of the wall clock that now sounded clearer without tension layered over it. She walked slowly toward the front window and watched the narrow road where Daniel's car had disappeared, the gravel undisturbed again, the air crisp and sharp with the scent of pine. There was no sense of victory. In her expression, there was steadiness. She turned back into the room and began a quiet inventory, not out of suspicion but out of care. She checked the thermostat, ensuring it was set to a protective temperature for the coming nights when Minnesota air would dip close to freezing. She opened each window latch, confirming they were secure. She walked through the hallway and into the guest room, where the quilt lay slightly creased from use. She smoothed it carefully, pressing her palm over the stitched pattern she had sewn during a winter long ago when the lake had been sealed in ice. The act was not symbolic, it was practical. Order restored itself in small gestures. In the kitchen, she removed the unfamiliar groceries Daniel had purchased and placed them neatly into a box. Nothing dramatic. Nothing thrown away in anger. She would donate the unopened items in town before returning to Minneapolis. Ownership did not require spite. It required discipline. She rinsed her teacup and set it back in the cabinet, this time placing her porcelain cups where she preferred them, aligned evenly, handles facing the same direction. Outside, a faint hum approached along the lake, and she stepped onto the back deck to see a neighbor guiding a small aluminum fishing boat across the water. The man lifted a hand in greeting, unaware of the quiet dispute that had just concluded within these walls. Margaret raised her hand in return, composed, unburdened by the need to explain. She sat in one of the wooden chairs Thomas had built himself, the wood weathered but sturdy, and allowed herself a long, measured breath. The lake stretched wide before her, reflecting late morning light in shifting silver bands. She remembered the first time she and Thomas had stood on this very deck, measuring the distance to the water's edge with a tape measure, debating whether to extend the platform by 18 inches for better balance when stepping into their small boat. They had chosen 18 inches. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was precise. Precision had defined their partnership. Daniel's attempt to rewrite that history had not failed because of hostility. It had failed because of documentation and memory aligned. Margaret returned inside and retrieved a small notepad from her briefcase. She wrote a brief entry with the date and time, noting that Daniel had vacated the premises voluntarily. At 9 o'clock in the morning, she recorded that the keys had been returned and that no further action was necessary. It was not vindictive. It was thorough. She then called her attorney in Minneapolis and confirmed that the matter had resolved without incident. The conversation was brief, professional, and calm. When she ended the call, she felt no surge of relief, only confirmation that boundaries, once established, hold firm. By early afternoon, sunlight had grown warmer across the dock. Margaret walked down the wooden steps toward the water, each board creaking softly beneath her weight, and paused at the edge where the lake met the shore. She crouched slightly and let her fingers skim the surface, the water cool and clear. The ripples expanded outward in quiet circles before settling again. That was how she understood the morning's events. A disturbance. Then stillness. She stood and looked back at the house, its shutters straight, its windows clean, its structure unchanged despite the brief occupation. It did not feel smaller. It felt steadier. Margaret returned to the deck and sat once more, her posture upright, her gaze fixed on the horizon where water met sky. She knew Daniel might speak of the situation differently elsewhere, might frame it as cold or unnecessary. She could not control that. What she could control was the line between presence and possession. And as the afternoon light strengthened and the wind softened to a gentle breeze, the lake house stood quiet behind her, no longer contested, no longer uncertain, simply hers in the way that had always mattered most. By late afternoon the light had shifted again, turning warmer and lower across the surface of the lake, and Margaret remained seated on the deck long after the air had grown cooler, her posture relaxed but upright, as though she were listening to something deeper than the faint ripple of water against the dock. The house behind her no longer felt interrupted. It felt restored. She rose slowly and stepped back inside, closing the sliding door with a soft click, then walked to the small writing desk near the staircase where Thomas used to sort mail during summer evenings. She opened the top drawer and found a stack of old correspondence tied neatly with a thin ribbon, letters Thomas had written during business trips years ago, each one folded carefully, each one deliberate. She untied the ribbon and selected a single envelope dated 6 years before his passing. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the ink remained steady and firm. In the letter, Thomas had written about the lake house not as property, but as anchor, a place that steadied him when the world outside felt uncertain. He had mentioned Daniel briefly, noting his brother's restlessness, his tendency to confuse proximity with entitlement. Margaret remembered the conversation that had followed that letter, the two of them seated at this very desk reviewing their estate plan line by line. Thomas had insisted on clarity, on language that left no room for assumption, not because he distrusted family, but because he understood how grief could distort memory and how silence could invite revision. Margaret folded the letter and returned it to its place, her movements careful, almost ceremonial. She then opened her laptop and logged into the county property portal, verifying once more that the deed remained properly recorded, that the trust documents reflected the correct status. It was not paranoia. It was confirmation. She printed a fresh copy and placed it in the briefcase beside the original, reinforcing documentation with repetition. Outside, a breeze stirred the tops of the trees, and the sound of distant laughter carried faintly from another cabin down the shoreline. Life continued in small, ordinary rhythms. Margaret moved through the house again, checking the back door lock, adjusting the blinds in the living room, ensuring the fireplace flue was properly closed. In the guest room, she paused briefly, noticing the faint indentation where Daniel's suitcase had rested. She did not dwell on it. She simply straightened the rug and closed the door halfway, restoring proportion to the space. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple dinner, slicing an apple, warming a bowl of soup, and setting the table for one. The act felt neither lonely nor triumphant. It felt accurate. As she ate, she looked toward the mantel where Thomas's photograph remained centered. "You were right," she said softly, not as a lament but as acknowledgement. Boundaries were not cruelty. They were preservation. When dusk began to settle over the lake, she stepped outside once more, this time carrying a small lantern to place on the edge of the deck. The glow cast a gentle circle of light across the wood planks, illuminating the carved initials in the railing that Thomas had added during their 15th summer. Margaret traced the carving with her fingertips, feeling the shallow grooves beneath her skin. The air carried a hint of approaching frost, the kind that would settle thin and silver by morning. She knew she would leave at sunrise, returning to Minneapolis with the house secured for winter, but she did not feel rushed. She felt resolved. Ownership, she reflected, was not proven in confrontation but in continuity. Daniel's departure had not changed the foundation of the lake house. It had revealed it. Margaret stood quietly, watching the sky deepen into indigo, and allowed the steady presence of the water and wood and memory to settle fully around her. The house no longer held tension. It held structure. And in that structure, she found not just legal confirmation, but something steadier, something earned over years of careful decisions and shared intention. Margaret woke before sunrise, not because of unease, but because the house had always carried a different kind of quiet in the early morning, a clarity that felt almost deliberate. The air was colder now, and a thin veil of frost clung to the railing outside the bedroom window, catching the first faint hint of light along the horizon. She dressed carefully, layering a wool sweater over a pressed blouse, then walked through the hallway one last time. The floorboards responded to her steps with the same soft creak they had offered for more than 2 decades, unchanged by the brief disruption that had passed through these rooms. In the kitchen, she brewed a final cup of coffee, watching the steam rise in slow spirals, and stood at the window overlooking the lake. The water lay still, a muted gray beneath a pale sky, and for a moment she allowed herself to stand without thought, without calculation, simply present. She carried her coffee to the living room and paused before the fireplace, her gaze settling on the carved initials Thomas had etched so many summers ago. She did not speak aloud this time. There was no need. The conversation between memory and present had already been settled. She moved methodically through the house, unplugging small appliances, checking that each window latch was secure, adjusting the thermostat to a steady protective setting for the coming winter. In the guest room, she ensured the quilt was smoothed flat, the closet empty except for spare blankets and coats, the rug aligned evenly beneath the bed. The indentation from Daniel's suitcase had faded almost entirely, as though the house itself preferred balance. Margaret carried her briefcase to the dining table and slipped the printed documents back inside, aligning them carefully with the original deed and trust papers. Documentation did not replace memory, but it fortified it. She placed the briefcase beside her overnight bag and took one final walk onto the deck. The boards felt firm under her feet, and the lake stretched wide and steady before her. A light wind skimmed across the surface, creating narrow ripples that moved outward and then settled again. She thought about the difference between disturbance and damage. A ripple altered the surface, but left the depth untouched. Daniel's presence had been a ripple. The foundation remained intact. Margaret stepped down the wooden stairs toward the dock and stood at the edge where water met wood. She let her hand hover just above the surface this time, not touching it, simply acknowledging it. Ownership, she reflected, was not possession of space for its own sake. It was guardianship of intention. Thomas had understood that. He had trusted her with clarity, not sentiment. She turned back toward the house and felt no heaviness in her chest, no lingering resentment. What remained was steadiness. She walked inside, locked the back door, then the front, turning the key with measured precision. The metallic click echoed softly in the entryway. She placed the key back on her ring and picked up her bags. As she stepped onto the gravel driveway, frost crunched faintly beneath her shoes, a reminder that seasons moved forward whether conflict lingered or not. She paused once more to look at the shutters, the roofline, the narrow chimney rising into the pale morning sky. The house stood unchanged, quiet and dignified. Margaret slid into the driver's seat of her car and started the engine, allowing it a moment to warm in the cool air. The road ahead curved gently back toward the highway, toward Minneapolis, toward the life she had built with the same deliberate care. As she pulled away, she did not look back in doubt. She looked back in recognition. The lake house remained where it had always been, anchored by intention and reinforced by clarity. And as the trees lined the road in steady rows, Margaret drove forward with the calm understanding that boundaries, once drawn with precision, do not diminish connection. They define it.